Legend of Total War here, and today we're doing another top 5 Total War video, this time covering the very subjective list of top 5 most boring factions in a Total War game. Now, as I said, this is going to be very subjective. There'll be no objective truth to this, and I expect that a lot of people will disagree. But this is my personal preferences. I guess lack of personal preferences. Now, the main thing I want to say just on the intro is just the criteria. Real simple. I'm going to pick interesting games, but factions in those interesting games that just have no flavor. And those are the ones which will be in this list. Anyway, let's jump straight into the number 5 pick. Coming in at number 5 are the Gara Mountains in Total War Attila, and the primary reason for that is that the beginning of their campaign simply has no challenge to it. Now, it's not due to them being particularly strong or particularly rich, it's due to the fact that they're up against the two most powerful factions in the game that will put up the resistance of a wet noodle. All of Western Roman Empire's forces are north of Africa, in Gaul, in Italy, and so on, dealing with the barbarian invasion up north. All of the Eastern Roman Empire's armies are in either Anatolia or in Egypt or in Palestine. They are not a threat. So you can take apart the Tripolitania and Libya at your own convenience with no resistance. And these are some decent territories because you're able to access the camel resource. So you're not going to struggle financially, you're not going to struggle militarily, you can take your time with your enemies, and by the time you've captured them and somebody does decide to declare war on you, it's too late by that point. It doesn't matter because you've been able to establish yourself in a campaign that is notorious for being difficult to establish yourself. So that's why they get the number 5 slot. Anyway, let's now move on to the number 4 slot. Coming in at number 4 are the Russians in Medieval 2. Now, the primary reason for these guys being so boring is because they're isolated, especially at the beginning of the campaign. Now, it doesn't always remain so, but the most interesting part of any particular campaign is the beginning. They are surrounded by rebel settlements more so than any other faction in this game. It will be a while before you even come in contact with any real resistance. You're free to take on all of these settlements around you. The closest other faction is Poland, which isn't particularly strong to begin with, and Hungary from down here. In addition to that, they're one of only 2 factions in this game that doesn't get access to one of the most interesting, unique mechanics to Medieval 2, the Crusades or Jihad mechanic, the other being the Byzantine Empire. But what sets them apart with the Byzantine Empire is the Byzantine is beset on all sides and has an incredibly interesting roster, history, and situation to deal with, whereas Russia has nothing to do basically until the Mongols arrive, and that's why they get the number 4 spot. Anyway, let's now move on to the number 3 spot. Coming in at number 3 is Spain for Rome Total War. Now, all of the barbarian factions in this game are lacking compared to the civilized faction. They're not able to access the final 2 tiers of any particular settlement, and they don't generally have particularly large army rosters. Some of times they do have strong army rosters. Gaul does get some pretty strong units, but in the case of Spain, their army and their faction in general just has no uniqueness to it. Most of their army roster is shared with Carthage, and the only really unique unit that they have available to them is the Bull Warrior. Even the Naked Fanatics is shared with other factions as well, as every other unit pretty much can be hired by other factions within their own faction roster. They have a pretty uninteresting position. It's a strong position, which also kind of means that there's not much challenge. But at the beginning of the campaign, you'll just be going up against Carthage, which is essentially your own units, going up against each other. It's just not an interesting campaign. Anyway, let's now move on to number 2. Coming in at number 2 are the RDA in Total War Rome 2. Now, I haven't played as every faction in Total War Rome 2, but I have played as these guys in my many hours and playthroughs of this game, and I can say without a doubt that of all my playthroughs, these guys here were by far the most boring. And to sum up why they're so boring, purely because they're beta male losers. These guys are the losers of the Adriatic. They just have nothing going for them. Their army roster is as plain as boring as any other faction. and their faction traits have the flavor of stale bread. If you have a look at it, we've got Balkan tribes, which of all the culture tribes is probably the most boring. Reduced recruitment costs of mercenary, increased upkeep cost. Particularly boring. And then there's their faction trait, increasing income from raiding, and extra 2 recruit slots in all ports. Particularly boring. Now, me personally in this game, I don't bother with raiding that much because I don't find it to be a very effective way to make lots of cash. Of course, they do better raiding than any other faction, but it's not really a good long-term solution, in my opinion. Now, they do have a very challenging starting position, and that's maybe a plus for some people, but when these guys have just got nothing going for them for such a long time, you can get into a complete rut. Because the problem with them is that even once you go beyond tier 1 and tier 2, these guys still suck. They just don't have much going for them. It seems to me that just no effort was really put into this faction. Now, they're not necessarily the weakest faction in this game, but given their position, given their faction traits, they, like I said, they just have no flavor, no spark. In the campaign that I played with them, I gave up after about 30 turns, not because I wasn't doing well, I had almost captured Rome, but simply because I just got bored into submission. Like I said, these guys are the losers of the Adriatic. Anyway, let's now move on to the number 1 slot for the most boring faction in a Total War game. Coming in at number 1 are the Warriors of Chaos in Total War Warhammer 1 and 2. Now, the Warhammer fantasy world that this game is set in is full of races that have such unique, interesting mechanics, and Chaos, lore-wise, is supposed to be one of them. Probably one of the most interesting from a lore-wise position. However, the way the game has represented them, they are one-dimensional brutes, brainless brutes, that really just don't fit in the campaign at this stage here. Now, I'm under the understanding that when Warhammer 3 comes out, a huge focus is going to be on Chaos, and they're going to get a lot of the roster that is currently missing. You know, a lot of the demons and weird creatures that come from the Chaos Wastes, which are only really represented by a couple of units at the moment. If you look at Call of Warhammer Beginning of the End Times, a mod for Medieval 2, you'll really see a huge difference between the way Chaos is represented here and in that mod for Medieval 2, which does it far more justice. Now, in this particular campaign, you gotta ask yourself, what do you do? Well, you take Archaon, and you go and kill shit. Or you take your whichever legendary lord you selected, and you just go and kill shit. Now that's fine, but that's all you do. There's nothing else to do. You don't have to worry about appeasing any particular chaos gods. It's really just reflected by favor, which is money. Whereas if you compare it to Norsca, when Norsca burns down a settlement, they're able to dedicate their destruction to a particular god, balancing the way that you serve one god or another. Comparing it to Norsca, which is another chaos faction essentially, they've also got other mechanics that make up for their, somewhat one-dimensional army. And speaking of the one-dimensional army, Chaos has probably one of the most boring army rosters in the game. Again, it's going to come down a lot to personal preferences, but to summarize the army of the Warriors of Chaos, it's just this. Melee. That's it. They've only got melee units. Okay? They've got different types of melee units, but your job as the Warriors of Chaos is just get into melee combat and win that way. Now, I would say that based on my experience in this game, on the campaign, that melee is one of the least effective ways to win battles. It's not that favorable, especially when you've got access to very powerful magic, very powerful ranged units, artillery, beasts that all have incredible abilities. Going into melee is important, but when it's the only card you've got in your deck, it's a bit on the dull side of things, which is why when Warhammer 1 first came out, Chaos had an extremely low win rate on the tournament, on the ladders, because they just don't have much going for them. They're strong, but physical strength alone is not enough to win battles, so they do come across as quite lacking. Now, they do have some magic, but when you compare them to the Vampire accounts, which is another melee faction, it's almost non-comparable in terms of the differences. The Vampire accounts have so many unique mechanics in the campaign, and their magic is so beneficial to the way that their army structure works in terms of healing magic and just wiping out complete armies with death. Warriors of Chaos are just a bit of a limp noodle when it comes to that. So, what mechanics do they have? Well, you can research stuff. That's great. Their research tree it's fairly large. Not particularly grand, but it's okay. Probably one of the best things about them. But what about diplomacy? Now, you wouldn't expect diplomacy to be a big part of Chaos. And you'd be right. They really can't initiate any diplomacy with anyone. Few people, like greenskins, but apart from that, nope. So my problem there is that they don't have any other mechanics. It seems to me like all of the other races have got something else to make them unique. Whether you're playing as the Empire, you're setting up officers, you're playing as the greenskins, getting war armies and keeping fightiness up, you're playing as the dwarfs, accumulating oath gold, which up until recently wasn't in the game. And prior to that, I probably would have been a strong contester for the dwarfs to have this #1 slot. But with that tiny little bit of content, the dwarfs have actually gone up massively on my personal interest list. I no longer completely hate the dwarfs roster. But the Chaos Warriors, they got nothing going for them. If you look at Bretonnia, Bretonnia's got some interesting... Bretonnia is very weak, okay? This is not a weakest faction video. Bretonnia is probably the weakest faction in this game. But they do have some interesting mechanics. They've got chivalry, they've got the peasant mechanic. Not my favorite mechanics, but at least it's there. These guys here, they've got nothing. You don't have to answer to any Chaos Gods. You don't have to appease them. You don't have to do shit. In fact, you don't even have to go down and burn down the world. You could, if you really want to, just vassalize a lot of the Norscan guys and let them do it for you. Meanwhile, you just sit up in the north and chill and suck each other off. Sigvald probably enjoys that. The only interesting legendary lord, in my opinion, in terms of the battle is Kolek. Kolek's a beast, I'll give him that. But apart from that, their army roster is just very much dull in comparison to every other race in this game. Now, of course, that is my personal opinion. I fully expect that people are going to disagree with that, but I think I've given some pretty good reasons as to why these guys are in desperate need of some content. There's just not much to do. So that's my top 5 list on the top 5 most boring factions in a Total War game. I completely expect that there is going to be a lot of hate in the comments because I've probably selected one of your favorite races as one of the most boring. This list here is completely subjective, so don't take this as an objective truth. This was just a my subjective list, okay? So, whatever, tell me which factions you think are more boring, and who knows, you might even change my mind. There might have been something that was so boring it actually slipped my mind. And also don't forget to post what you want to be the next top 5 video in the comments. Until then, I'll see you next time, fuckers.